Summit friends, please welcome to the stage, Dina Fadas.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Wow. Amazing. I'm looking around this room, and I also know there are literally thousands of folks joining us from around the world virtually right now. How's the morning been? So by show of hands, what does the date, does the date July 3rd, 1981 mean anything to you? I'm seeing some hands raised. May I ask someone who's bold to shout out what it means to you?
New York Times article on cases of a mysterious disease being reported.
Yep. I just got chills on the back of my neck as you said that. Yes. The New York Times headline, Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals. Rare cancer seen in 41 homosexuals. It's our 25th anniversary as Out and Equal, and we are in part in a reflective space, pondering where we've been as a community and as a movement in order to understand where we're going. Last year, at our executive forum, my colleague and I gathered about 300 leading LGBTQ and ally execs, mainly from the private sector and from federal agencies. And we lined the room with events and headlines of significance to our community. And we had folks put by little color tags if the event was personally formative to them. In other words, they were alive, they were conscious, in other words, they weren't a toddler. They knew about it, but it didn't affect them, or they weren't alive during it. And to my surprise, and to the surprise of others in the room, that image of that headline, July 3rd, 1981, got so few colored tags that this was of personal significance and folks lived through it. And in the room, multiple men in their 40s, 50s, and 60s cried. And they said, I just fear that we are losing our history. And so today, we are thrilled to be joined by two individuals who are literally speeding up history. They have sped up in a lifetime of service to which I think we all owe them a debt of gratitude. They have sped up history through their activism over the years, their boldness and their courage. It's my great, great honor to introduce two individuals who will be in dialogue for all of us today. They're going to talk to one another, and then we're going to have an opportunity for each of you to ask questions, and those of you joining live. First, Paul Kawada. Since 1989, Paul Kawada has served as Executive Director of the National Minority AIDS Council, NMAC, the premier organization dedicated to building leadership in communities of color to address the challenges of HIV/AIDS. Under Kawada's, I'm going to say HIV and AIDS. There's a slash there, and there's a reason we say HIV and AIDS. Under Kawada's direction, NMAC implemented the first HIV treatment education programs in the United States targeted to minorities, developed the organization's high-profile meetings, including the United States Conference on AIDS, currently the largest annual AIDS-related gathering in the country, as well as the HIV Prevention Leadership Summit, formerly known as the Community Planning Leadership Summit, and the National AIDS Treatment Action Forum. A leading HIV and AIDS advocate, Kawada has represented NMAC in many of the most significant legislative achievements in the fight against the epidemic. These include the passage and renewal of the Ryan White Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Act, CARE, the Housing Opportunities for People with AIDS Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressional Hispanic Caucus expansion of federal funding for HIV and AIDS programs in communities of color. Our second speaker is Peter Staley. I've combined you two already. Peter Staley. Peter Staley has been a long-term AIDS and gay rights activist, first as a member of ACT UP New York, then as the founding director of TAG, the Treatment Action Group. He was a 2016 fellow at Harvard's Institute of Politics and is a leading subject in the Oscar-nominated documentary, How to Survive a Plague. Show of hands, who's seen How to Survive a Plague? Wonderful. That is a must-watch. More recently, Staley co-founded the Prep for All collaboration and the COVID-19 Working Group New York, and is the lead named plaintiff in Staley v. Gilead, a major federal antitrust case against Big Pharma set for trial next year. Peter Staley recently published his memoirs titled Never Silent, Act Up, and My Life in Activism. On a personal note, I grew up in Washington in the 80s, not far from the National Institutes of Health. And the image of Peter Staley and folks like Paul and these early activists is something that's been my North Star. I'm one of those born this way gays, always knew I was different, and always knew, even at a young age, this was my community. And as I'm looking at my friend Craig here with his Silence Equals Death t-shirt, the idea that in the face of extreme adversity, when our government was failing us, when so many structures did not meet the needs of our incredible queer community, these individuals shored up their strength. They were creative. They exuded what I can only think of as queer power. And it's something that's carried me forward. I have the absolute pleasure of welcoming to the stage two personal heroes. I've already made them feel embarrassed, if not a teensy bit old as I revealed my age, but we all look the same age. So gentlemen, may I please call you to the stage, Peter Staley and Paul Kawada. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here today. It is great to see you all. I want to start by saying thank you to Out and Equal for inviting us to speak with you. You know, you are speaking to the two oldest queens in the room. we had breakfast this morning and we were talking about the old days. You know, when you've been around as long as we have, you've seen a lot of changes. You've seen a lot of what the world could be. Unfortunately, you've also seen a lot of bad things. You know, I'm about to say something very political, and so I want you to know that Out and Equals had nothing to do with what I said. They wanted me to clarify that. And that, and that part of why you're here, I hope, is to talk about the fight, to talk about the fact that whether or not it was chosen, we are at ground zero of the culture wars in America. You know, when you talk about Disney versus DeSantis, it is here, and so I am so glad to see all of you decided not to boycott this meeting. It is part of what you need to know is that the work that we're going to be doing today has absolute connections to the work that we're going to be talking about when we look at the founding of ACT UP. Part of what you need to understand is that we need you to fight. We need you to fight like you've never fought in your entire life, because our lives are literally under attack. Washington is a very ugly place right now. And for so many of us, we get to live in these bubbles, and we get to live in places where we feel like we're protected. We get to live in places where we feel like our rights are okay. The truth about it is that it's not. That what you're seeing happening to transgender community is just the first step. And if you think as gay men we are protected, you are sorely misled. Because right now there is a case that's going to the Supreme Court called Bravewood. And if you haven't heard of Bravewood, I'd ask you to look it up. But basically what it says is Christian companies do not want to pay for PrEP for gay men because it's against their religious values. And they won. They won. And so it's being appealed, and it's being appealed to the Fifth Circuit. And the Fifth Circuit has not been our friend. And what's going to happen is we're probably going to lose in the Fifth Circuit, and then it's going to go to the Supreme Court. And what do you think is going to happen at this Supreme Court? We're probably going to lose. And what it's going to do is it's going to do two things. Number one, it's going to codify the rights of organizations to discriminate because it goes against their religious values. But two, and probably more importantly, and the real reason for this lawsuit, is because they want to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. They're doing what's called a Trojan horse with the Affordable Care Act. They're backdooring it, as they say. They're taking what's called the Prevention Task Force and they're questioning its authority. And by doing that, they are basically going to be destroying all the preventative care that is in the ACA right now. And that includes so many services that all of us take for granted. And so all of this has a string back to early AIDS activism. I was telling Peter, I am really looking forward. He's going to tell you about the founding of ACT UP. And what I want you to know is that that founding is not dead. That you all are going to be the generation that has to take it up. You all are going to be the folks that have to carry the torch, the water, the whatever you need to carry up that hill. Because if this world doesn't change, if we are at the precipice of deciding who America is going to be. Is Ron DeSantis going to be the America that we have? Or are we going to be an open society that values diversity, equality, and inclusion? It is a tough fight, and it is happening not just in Washington, it is happening in boardrooms. All you have to do is look at what happened to Budweiser, look at what happened to Target, look at what happened to Disney, to understand that your companies are not going to be immune, that you have to have a strategy for how you are going to be dealing with the onslaught that is facing all of us. And they're playing for keeps. There are currently 40 riders that the Freedom Caucus has proposed to this year's budget that looks at getting rid of any kind of mention of abortion, of drag queens. Drag queens, why are we talking about drag queens? About HIV, about LGBTQ. They cut $600 million out of the ending the HIV epidemic budget of this year's Congress. So this is a fight like you've never seen. And it started there. And so let's hear from Peter about ACT UP and where it all started. Thank you, Peter, for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul. When we were planning for this,
We were sitting.
I had no idea. We were both asked when we met, and you surprised me and said that we met before ACT UP.
We did. Oh, I forgot to tell that story. Okay. So as you know, you see the Peter before you now. I met Peter when he was this cute Twinkie boy. And he had just started on Wall Street. Boy, I'm just going to tell all your tea right now, aren't I? He had just started on Wall Street, and he was about, one of my friends had a crush on him, and it was Griff Gold. And Griff, listen, I'm just putting it all out there, and Griff was one of those original activists in the movement who started PWAC, which was the People with AIDS Coalition in New York City. And Griff was enamored with you. And I just thought, he looks like a little Twinkie boy to me. But that's when I remember meeting Peter.
So, yeah, I was shocked by this. Because it actually was my pre-activism before ACT UP was was born. And it was one of the darkest years of my life. It was shortly after I was diagnosed. Before my diagnosis in 1985, I was, like many of you in here, I was working at a Fortune 500 company. Fresh out of college in Oberlin College in '83, I arrived in New York City. I had been hired by what was then called Morgan Guarantee, now called JP Morgan Chase. And I became a US government bond trader, so I was kind of I was in this crazy business. Totally closeted, as was everyone on Wall Street. There were no out queer people on the street at all, and certainly not in the bond market. And I was viewing Wall Street as a stepping stone for me personally as to a career in politics later on. I thought I could like self-finance my own congressional campaign in my 30s after making my nest egg in my 20s. And who knows what would happen after that. I was mindful of history that Kennedy had become a senator in his 30s and then a president by his early 40s. So that was kind of the beeline I was on. But 2 years after starting the job, I got some very shocking news in the fall of '85, just after Rock Hudson had shocked the country by announcing he had AIDS, and he died within, I think, 6 weeks of the announcement. And the country this was already 4 years into the crisis, but the country had completely ignored it up until this point. And Ronald Reagan hadn't said the words. All of a sudden the press was focused, the country went into this huge panic, and I found out that I had it. And it caught me off guard. I was closeted, clueless. There were no therapies, there were no drugs. I didn't know the gay community in New York. The only thing I knew was the gay bars in the East Village. I didn't know who the gay leadership was. I didn't know about any of the AIDS organizations. I didn't know who Larry Kramer was. The Normal Heart, if you've all seen it, it's a great movie, a great play. That whole history, which is 1981, 82, 83, I knew none of that. I jumped on this. I went home. I told my family one at a time. I was very lucky that we were a non-religious family, and they were there for me and became my original support group. But then I got on this learning curve of trying to learn what was going on in New York. And I found GMHC. And at a support group there, across the room, was Griffin Gold, who was the founder, one of the co-founders of the People with AIDS Coalition in New York City, which is the organizations, and there was one in San Francisco, et cetera, the birth of the self-empowerment movement in HIV, with the Denver principles. And Griffin, within 2 weeks, well, first we slept together, and then within two... It's a gay, it's a gay handshake. Within 2 weeks, he was introducing me to Michael Callan and Michael Hirsch, and I was meeting. I had no idea, but I was meeting like the frontline AIDS activists. And I think right around that time, I met you, and so I'm on this learning curve, and I'm getting. The emotion that starts brewing is two emotions, fear and anger, that there wasn't anything. I was trying to see what was happening, what was going on, that there wasn't much going on, and that the US government was doing nothing, and that's where the anger started. And then all of us got really, really lucky a few months later in early '87. I missed the moment itself, but I still didn't know who Larry Kramer was, still hadn't met him. But he gave this speech at the center in New York, the LGBT Center. And it was a call to action. We had our service organizations, we had our national gay rights groups who were kind of playing a delicate inside game at the time. They were very scared of doing anything too in your face because they were horrified of a national backlash. There was tons of talk of quarantining people with HIV, and there was this posture in the community of don't make things worse. It could get a lot worse. So, but Larry was having none of it, and he said we had to take to the streets. We're all going to die if we keep up this current timid posture. And so within 48 hours, over 100 people met at the center and started trying to come up with a name for this new group and set a schedule of meetings and said, right at the first meeting, where should we demonstrate first? And they picked my front door at work. They picked Wall Street. And that's how I actually found out about ACT UP. I missed the Kramer speech, but I was on my way to work and I got handed a flyer by this cute ACT UP activist and went onto the trading floor. Didn't see the demo, but I saw it on the news that night. And at the same time, the FDA held a press conference because it made news. It was on the national news because the press had never seen that many gay people get arrested and put their bodies, and they hadn't seen a patient group, a group that were dying of a disease, take to the streets and protest. So we were incredibly novel, and we grabbed the country's attention. I got myself to the very next meeting and never looked back. I did this crazy year of trying to keep my job. Bond trader by day and radical AIDS activist by night. It didn't last. My CD4 cells crashed during that year and went down to 103, I think was my lowest. And I knew below 200 that the clock was really, really ticking. And I probably had about 2 years from that point in front of me. So I went on disability as soon as that test came out and decided to give whatever time I had left to the movement. And we made history. There's no doubt about it. And we knew we were. When I went to that first meeting, oh my God, it was the third or fourth ACT UP meeting. There were already 150 people in the room. Everyone from a handful of Stonewall veterans, so guys that looked like me now, were there. And this first time I had seen that many lesbians. And that blew my socks off. It's like, what are they doing here? And it's, but they were in charge. They had done. They had been doing movement activism long before all the younger gay men like me who were walking in, all through the 70s, 60s even. And they had this movement memory that transplanted from day one into ACT UP so we could hit the ground running with disability training, how to do demonstrations, how to deal with the media, how to organize a movement. And that first meeting, we packed that first floor hall in the center, and the energy was just palpable. I could tell on everyone's faces, and especially the Stonewall veterans, that they knew that they hadn't seen anything like this since the first few years after Stonewall, that this was what they had been waiting for since GAA, et cetera, had kind of fallen apart in the early 70s. This was that we were going to make history. We didn't know whether we would succeed or flop, but we were going to grab the nation's attention and do something with it. That we had the momentum to do that. And we did. For 5 years, we grabbed the country's attention, and we didn't let go. If you saw How to Survive a Plague, it has this message of us taking to the streets and grabbing the country's attention, and it has the very truthful message of how we became our own experts in HIV/AIDS, how we learned the science, how we learned the regulatory process, and how we worked hand in hand with partners we could find in the scientific community to grease the wheels, get things going faster, and ultimately find the treatments in 1996 that turned HIV/AIDS from a guaranteed death sentence to potentially being a manageable disease as long as you had access to the therapies that came out then. That is a true story. That is a true story, but it missed, I think, the thing that was a prerequisite for 96. It wasn't the self-taught geeky activism. That was hugely important, but it wasn't our big bang. Our big bang was people power. It was activists in the streets, and let me tell you why. When we burst on the national scene, we became this huge story. The press was fascinated in us. They hadn't seen hundreds of gays constantly getting arrested month after month, ever. There was a little burst in San Francisco around the Milk assassination, and then later after the White Night riots. Those were like 24-hour news cycles, I swear to God, came and went. This was a sustained national news story where queer people were in the streets and giving footage to the country on a constant basis. When we surrounded the FDA, which was our huge national coming out, where all the ACT UP groups came together and shut down the FDA for a day, and we were the lead story on all 3 networks. That shattered, for the American public, that shattered their myth of the homosexual, of being timid, when they were being threatened, of being cowering in a corner. We gave them this totally different picture of determination. We knew what we were talking about, anger, indignation, and we didn't have to make them love us, and they didn't right away, but we definitely gave them a massive guilt trip, because the media, they knew that Reagan hadn't said the word AIDS. They knew that unlike every other epidemic in US history, including some small ones like Legionnaire's disease in 1977, which was on the front page of the New York Times about 8 times in 2 weeks after the first case, and a lead story on the national news for weeks until they solved it within a month. So they knew that epidemics always got the national attention, and this was 6 years after the first cases. And Reagan, our president, hadn't said the word of the disease. It's just mind-boggling. And they were letting the gay community die by the thousands. And they started doing stories using our B-roll of bodies being dragged, and they combined it with stories of the Reagan administration has ignored this. Mayor Koch in New York has ignored this. So the gay community had to save itself during these 6 years. And they formed their own organizations to make sure that nobody with HIV AIDS would die alone. And they did stories on gay men's health crisis and San Francisco AIDS Foundation. And it showed this beautiful human response from our community of what to do when you're up against an epidemic and the country ignores you and is letting you die. And we made sure nobody died alone with our buddies programs. It was just an extraordinary thing. And that the country just went, fuck. Within Gallup polling is the first that asked Americans about homosexuality. They did it in 1977, near the end of the decade of sexual revolution. And it's an arcane question now. It's basically about sodomy laws. Should sex between same-sex partners be legal or illegal? So if you're caught having sex, should you be thrown in jail? Gay sex should be thrown in jail or left alone. In 1977, at the end of the sexual revolution, a large number of people, over 10%, said they didn't want to answer the question. But it was about even Steven. 45% said we should be thrown in jail. 45% said, leave them alone. When AIDS hit in '81, the throw them in jail line started rising. And this is one of the reasons why the national gay rights groups were very careful about what they were doing and tried to just largely played an inside game. The backlash started, and the throw them in jail line peaked right when ACT UP was formed at over 62%, with the leave them alone line way down in the gutter. And that's what we were facing. At that 62% was right before our FDA demo. The next time they asked a year later, the 62% dropped 21%. Huge drop. The leave them alone line flew up, the lines crossed, and it stayed crossed for the next 5 years until Don't Ask, Don't Tell. That's what we did. That's what we did. When those lines crossed, polling agencies asked Americans, should we be spending more on AIDS research? 80% of Americans said, spend more. 80% of Americans don't agree on anything anymore. Democrats, Republicans, all of them, spend more. At that point, immediately, Reagan and then Bush could not say no to any amount of money that Congress said to spend on AIDS. We went from the low about $150 to $200 million being spent on AIDS research when ACT UP was born in '87. Within 3 years, it was over $1 billion a year. And all the other disease groups in the country, cancer, heart disease, et cetera, they started to complain. I remember this op-ed in the New York Times from a heart disease expert complaining about the powerful AIDS lobby getting more than its fair share. Powerful AIDS lobby. We went from being ignored and left to die to that, and it was those dollars which then we geeked out to make sure it was spent well in the early 90s to actually find those therapies. But it's the dollar. If we didn't have the dollars to geek out with, there would be no therapies. It's those tax dollars that we loosened up by guilt-tripping the country. That's the reason I'm on this stage right now. That's the reason that 35 million people around the world living with HIV are on therapy right now and can look forward to a normal lifespan. It's this extraordinary movement. And the other great benefit was it broke that timidity of the gay rights movement. You know, we certainly had a burst of it after Stonewall, but then it was this inside, don't shake the boat, long period. And our great conceit was, you know, Larry Kramer's great brilliance was, this posture isn't working. We've got to go full frontal on the country, you know? Backlash be damned. We've got to show them what we're feeling, what's happening. We have to show them our humanity and go to the streets constantly. And we have adopted that posture ever since. It's like, you're going to deny us what? It's this indignation now. And we learn that posture creates change, that we can win with that posture of just being, you know, of leading with our indignation, our anger, our how dare you say that I can't have that, or how dare you attack my brothers and sisters and siblings in my movement. And now we're in a backlash again.
And so that's the question that I want to ask you is, how do we take that lesson from ACT UP, and what is the lesson for today? And what does it mean, you know, because you're sitting here in a room full of folks who believe, but maybe don't know what to do. And so what's the through line for all of us?
Okay. 7 minutes before we're going to go to open to questions here. First off, let me do the caveat. Whatever I say about activism today, take it with a grain of salt. Lesson number one, don't listen to old white dudes. When I was a young little twink.
He was.
In ACT UP, and we had the Stonewall veterans there, I have this distinct memory of one or two of them saying, you know, chastising the floor of ACT UP. You have to do this. This is the way we used to do it, and you're not making sense. You have to, and demanding that we do it this way. And we were like young. I remember my eyes rolling, and that was the right response, frankly. But I also didn't. I was on a learning curve. I didn't know my history, and someone told me I had to learn my history, and they suggested I watch this recent documentary that had won the Oscar for Best Documentary called The Life and Times of Harvey Milk, one of the greatest documentaries of all time. And I went to Blockbuster, got my VHS, stuck it in, dating myself.
You are old.
I am old. We remember Betamax. And then Betamax porn, it was really early. So I watched that, and here was I had never seen an organized queer community. And here was this hugely organized queer community in the city of San Francisco. And you know, the White Night Riots and all that, Harvey Milk was incredible, hugely inspirational. But the message I got from that was the organizing around defeating a statewide referendum that was going to kick out gay teachers from the school systems. And everyone thought it was guaranteed the public was going to say, kick the gay teachers out. There's huge homophobia. And they organized and organized statewide, and they won. They won. And one of the very first major large area victories for queer organizing. And that centered me. It's like, okay, we're not, you know, it's not starting now. Gay history is not starting with me. We're joining a long history, and we can add a chapter to that. And it was hugely inspiring. It centered me that I was part of something that was so beautiful and had been going on for so long. But every chapter is different. Every chapter is different. And we were going to write our own chapter. And it was a different time, it was a different issue, it was different politics, it was different technologies, news was slightly different. And so message number one, what we did in ACT UP isn't going to work today. And I deliver, you know, a pretty sad message that if ACT UP happened today, it would not succeed. We would not get 80% of Americans to feel guilty about what was happening. 80% of Americans don't agree on anything anymore. We did not have Fox News when we were there. We would have it now. They would brand us like they did with BLM as a group of terrorists. 40% of the country would hate us from day one. So without that huge supermajority of public opinion behind us, we would not have gotten fast change. We would have not had Congress behind us easily. Certainly we wouldn't have gotten Republican presidents to fold like a deck of cards, which is kind of what happened. So activism today, point blank, is harder for every movement on every issue. We are in a new world. It's a harder world. It's a harsher world. Unfortunately, my generation fucked up and handed it to you this way. And for that, I apologize. But the playbook is going to be very different. And you are going to be better at finding the answers of how to fix all that than old white guys like me. So have faith in yourself on that. I have ideas on that. You know, I'm like the old Stonewaller saying, I'm willing to share that during in the 2 minutes I got left. I think first and foremost, our nation's politics are broken. So the activists that inspire me the most are the ones that are doing the least sexy activism of all. And that is, they're going deep in the weeds on fixing our nation's politics. You saw the kids from the Parkland shooting. They organized a huge national march on Washington. And the very first campaign they did after that was to take to the road in a get out the vote thing. They did a whole national tour to make gun rights, gun safety issues a voting issue in their generation. And they were a major reason for the upcoming midterms after the shooting. And they were the major reason that there was a huge increase in millennial voting turnout for that midterm election, and they deserve huge credit for that. So the activists today getting their hands dirty in turning the Democratic Party into what they want it to be, and then making sure the Democrats get elected, those activists give me hope. And I know that's not sexy, getting into political politics and getting people elected, but all these movements, they can't get anything done without, if the Republican Party continues to control certain sectors of our government. And the Republican Party now is not really a traditional party. It's nuts, it's crazy, and it's going to destroy everyone. So they have to be,
and thank you to all the Republicans that are in the room.
They have to be taught. They have to be taught again and again on national stages and all the way down the line that they're on the wrong path and that they're going to continue to lose unless they wake up and reject the MAGA madness. So that's job number one. And job number two is do the geeky stuff that I borrow from ACT UP in becoming your own experts on specific issues. Climate change, I think, is an interesting one right now, where the leading activists are the geeks who are really working in organizations to find the technologies that are going to potentially turn things around. The geeks of the world, that's a great form of activism. Find an organization to work with, get paid for it, and do it. That's a lot of what AIDS activism is today. Those are prevention activists are generally geeks who are working in small AIDS organizations, working all the levers of power to use the tools we have today to lower HIV infections. That's why I'm with a group called Prep for All, which does amazing national work in that regard. And then if all shit hits the fan, we can all take to the streets en masse and try to save the country like BLM did in 2020. And those are the three options I think are left on the table for us. But I want to hear from you all, and we've got 13 minutes here. I did a little run over.
Thank
so
you.
Let's open it up.
Okay, let's questions. Come on, stand on up. If we can get a mic to them. Oh, good, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Alex Wynn, and thank you so much for being here. I grew up learning about the pandemic from reading Colin Hurst, Randy Schultz, and one book in particular really just brought it home to me was Alex Jeffers' Safest Houses, and it's just wonderful. Based on the question, what you've said, Peter, about, we have Stonewall, and then we have a period of just kind of don't rock the boat, and then ACT UP happened because of HIV/AIDS. I want to know what you think. Are we in a period of complacence where we're back in that place where, things are going okay, and that don't rock the boat? And is it that we're going to need something of tragic proportions to happen before we can get together and make changes as ACT UP did? And I want to challenge you also, Peter, on that, what you said about whether ACT UP is going to would work now in 2023. And, it's true that the nation can't agree on anything, much less 80%. But at the same time, efforts to treat and cure HIV and the funding for it is still going strong. And so I wonder if, our playbook, although it needs some, editing or amending, could still work. Thank you.
Well, first off, that funding is steady, but we just had the House write up its budget that slashes almost all HIV programs by 25, 30, 40% in next year. Now, the House isn't going to get its way, thankfully. The Senate's going to have its opinion as well, and it's going to have to, whatever comes out is going to have to get the president's signature. So I don't think those cuts are going to happen, but it's all under threat now. And we are going to have to find different ways to preserve that. The greatest international program that's keeping 35 million people alive right now, Google it right now, PEPFAR. It's totally, for the first time in its history, it's under threat. So it's a scary time. I don't think there's complacency out there. I think a lot of people are scared. One of the things that I do worry about is something very similar to complacency is is locking up. I mean, the problem seems so huge and large. I think a lot of us are, just for mental health self-preservation, are doing edibles and streaming. I know I am. You gotta do what you gotta do to work on this. And I've always said, somebody who is without hope and joy, or unable to enjoy life and has the mental health to move forward is a lousy activist. So you always have to work on this. So yes, take your time for those things. But some people are escaping altogether and like, I can't do anything. That's a threat. I'm not sure until the shit hits the fan that we're going to see the whole country take to the streets. In the meantime, all the people who know that you have the power to do something now, we need to be organizing in various ways, and you all can figure that out.
Okay, so let me tell you what you can do. And this is really important. Many, many, many of you work in Fortune 500 companies. Your companies provide the foundation for what America life is going to look like. And part of what happened in the Disney situation, and part of what happened to the CEO, the former CEO of Disney, was he forgot about his employees. He forgot about the fact that his employees want to work in companies that share their values. And so part of what you need to do is make sure that the leadership of your companies understand what your values are and follow those values. Because we need CEOs to stand up for us. We need companies to put their monies where their mouth is. We need particularly the PACs that your senior executives donate to companies that support our lives. You cannot vote for people who hate us and then call yourself an ally. Sorry. And so I just want you to understand that you sit in very, very important roles that cannot be passive. That if you don't want to live in a world where we started, when I first started working, nobody was out at their job. When I started work, I became an executive director in the 80s. I would never have hired me. It's just that nobody wanted HIV jobs back then. And so they get this unqualified kid to come up and go to Washington and try to figure this all out. And so you play the pivotal role of bridging corporate America to Washington, D.C. That I would bet you that every single one of your organizations has a lobbyist in Washington. Every single one of your organizations has a PAC or belongs to a PAC. And how are those lobbyists and how are those PACs representing your companies and representing you? And that's your power. Because the reality is that talent is hard to find, particularly good talent. You know this. You work with a lot of crap people, probably. You do. We all do. And so we know how valuable talent is. And companies are fighting to keep talented people. And you, as an individual, want to work probably hopefully in a company that shares your values. None of us, well, maybe some of us, but none of us want to work in companies that do bad. None of us want to work in companies that hurt the environment, that hurt the world, that do all these things. We want to give our talent, because we're not here that long. And so the talent that we have, we want to make sure that it's being used for good. And each of you has a talent, whether that talent is HR or finance or creative or whatever you're doing, you are sitting in your jobs as the talent that they want to keep. And they want to keep you happy. And that means that you've got to come out. that means you've got to tell the truth about your life. You know, coming out is one of the most powerful things that we can do. You know, speaking the truth about who we are as human beings living on the planet and what we expect, not just from our families and friends, but also from our employers. And so I just strongly encourage all of you, if you can, to come out, to tell the truth, to be that role model queen that everyone looks to. Because until we come out, we become a them. But once we tell our truth, we get to be a we. Question in the back.
Hi there. My name is Dylan Reese-Williams. I was so lucky with my colleague Nicole to be in that session that Dina was talking about at the opening and just learn so much history from all the wonderful executives there at the Executive Forum. My question for you and also for like everyone in the room, and I asked it at the Expo session, is what are your best resources for learning about the history of HIV and AIDS or gay history in general? Because that's something that probably everyone in this room recognizes is so important. And excuse me, LGBTQ plus history.
You know, if it's not on TikTok, then it didn't happen. and that's the reality of our world right now. And we all understand that if it's not on TikTok, is it real? And so part of the challenge that we have to figure out is how do we share our message to the next generation? And I think, well, we've been talking about this, and I've been talking with my staff all the time about we stand on the shoulders of people who changed the world. And you are the folks who get to take the benefit of all of their struggle and effort to make the world a better place. But it only happens when you tell the truth. And it only happens when you have the courage to say in a corporate meeting, but what about the LGBTQ community? And that's hard. I'm not gonna lie to you. The first time you do it, it's really scary. And the second time you do it, you have to look back at that first time and go, oh. By the 50th time, you're like, hey, I'm a gay man, I'm a queen, let's talk about what we need. And it gets easier. You know, it's kind of like coming out. You know, when you first come out, for all of us, it was that very scary experience of who do we tell? Can we tell our parents? Can we tell our best friend? We definitely can't tell anybody at work. And then as we go up and as we get comfortable and as we understand the power of the truth is when we can learn. Because I think what happens and what I hope sessions like this do is it helps you to understand that you're part of a much larger movement. Whether you know it or not, you are part of a community committed to equality and justice and change. And that all of you are here to make this world a better place. And part of why I know it is because you had your company send you to a queer meeting. You did.
Some good AIDS history to start with is the documentary How to Survive a Plague. The first major history book on AIDS was And the Band Played On. There's also an amazing book called How to Survive a Plague. And now there are many documentaries and many books on HIV/AIDS. So if you just get your toe into one of them, they will lead to the others. Same with queer rights history overall. There's an endless number of resources. Just dip your toe in. If if it bites you, you'll keep going and you'll eventually read the entire canon, unlike me. But
and just one other thing that I think is important to understand from the early days. There were a lot of particularly closeted gay men who were high up in corporations who helped us and supported us and raised money for us like they had never done in their entire lives. And so please, please, please do not minimize what you are doing. It is amazing what happened, back then, because people they loved were dying, and that they knew if they didn't fight, that they would spend the rest of their lives going to funerals. Question?
First off, thank you so much for sharing your stories. It's been amazing. It's been a pleasure listening to you guys. But my question was, do you think a solution to today's homophobia, transphobia, and all the hatred we face can be bipartisan like it might have been in the past? Or do you think any solution for today's issues are going to be more one-sided?
Well, I mean, you heard me go off on the Republican Party earlier. There will be opportunities locally and on some issues. For certain issues, you can still carve out some bipartisan support. Interestingly, AIDS has had a history of, because of what happened with the 80% number, of bipartisan support for the major laws that we passed that have continued to defend them. That might be beginning to fall apart this year, but that's been our history. So there are opportunities to work with. We actually, AIDS activists actually worked with Trump a little bit when he was president. He launched.
Only because he was so stupid.
Only because he was really stupid.
Let's just own that.
Yeah.
He didn't. But. So let me just say one quick thing about this one. I believe, like Dr. King said, that the arc of history is long and bends towards justice. I absolutely believe that. I also believe that right now we are at an inflection where it is impossible to work together. Where right now, unfortunately, your credentials depend on what side of the street you stand, and there seems to be no middle ground anymore. This is not a fight that any of us want. We did not step to this fight. This was not a fight that the LGBTQ community in any way wanted or was looking forward to, but we're being called to because they're weaponizing us. We're being called to because they're calling us pedophiles, and they're using that to gain votes and win elections. And so we don't have a choice. We don't have a choice. When you are being called a groomer and a pedophile and being used as the reason for people to vote for people who want you dead, you have to stand up. We have to go. Right. Sorry you took too long.
Community, the hope, you are both resilience embodied, and we are immensely grateful for you being here. Thank you so much. Are you both able to stick around just a little bit? I know some folks, no, we've got to get you on a flight is what we have to do. But on that note, the moment of urgency has not passed. We are in a moment of urgency. And so thank you both so much. Thank you so much.